Giovanni di Pietro di Bernardoni, born at the height of the Middle Ages, and he was a rich kid, son of a wealthy merchant, and like his friends, sought fortune and glory as a warrior, joined his city-state's army, and they marched against Perugia. He was taken prisoner, held for over a year, and while in the dungeons of Perugia, he was very, very ill, and he lapsed into severe fever, and in his fever, if Eben was here, I'd say he pulled an Eben, and he saw a voice, he saw a light, and he received a vision of eternity and emerged from the experience as the man we know as St. Francis of Assisi. And St. Francis, at a very young age, was venerated by the kings and nobles not only of Italy, but of what they call the Holy Roman Empire, which is essentially Germany. And they would come to him for counsel. In fact, the Pope even allowed him to create an entirely new order, the Franciscans, because the Pope said, "You have shamed us with your piety." Well, St. Francis was also part of the Fifth Crusade. Now, the Fifth Crusade was commanded by Cardinal Pelagius, and this was a huge military undertaking, 60,000 men, and the who's who of medieval warfare, they were there. You had the Knights Templar, the Knights Hospitaller, the Cathars, you had the French army, you had soldiers from England, the Venetian fleet was providing support. And it was different from other crusades because what they did is instead of initially attacking Jerusalem, the Crusaders headed towards Egypt, to the port of Damietta. And the reason for that was they wanted to cut off the wealth and power and the soldiers from Egypt that were constantly giving the Turkish Empire its power. And if they could do that and seize Egypt and basically bankrupt the Turks, then they could move upon Jerusalem. But it was a lot easier said than done, and the siege of Damietta was absolutely horrific. It lasted 3 years, and about a year after it began, Francis of Assisi arrives, and he did the unthinkable. He crossed the lines into the Muslim camp and met directly with Sultan al-Kamil. Historians are still unsure how he did that, but what we do know is that he spent a week with the Sultan. The Sultan admired him as a man of God, and Francis was impressed with the Sultan's piety and devotion to God. The two men spent hours and hours in consultations. Francis tried to convert the Sultan. He said, "No, I'm a devout Muslim." But what the Sultan did is allowed Francis a special dispensation to form a mission in the city of Jerusalem. So Francis and his followers could go to Jerusalem, and that Franciscan mission exists to this day. In return, Francis goes back to Cardinal Pelagius and the Crusaders and tries to broker a peace deal, which doesn't happen. The Crusaders were hell-bent on conquering Egypt, and without getting into the intricacies of the Fifth Crusade, it ended up in a horrible military disaster for the Crusaders. Disillusioned, Francis returns to Italy. Now, in the medieval era, if you walked around Italy or France or England going, "I see dead people," that didn't go real well. But if you joined the clergy and were receiving visions of the Holy Spirit, that was a different matter entirely. Let's start with St. Francis. Not only was he wise and pious, but he would go into a profound state of prayer and develop stigmata, where he bled from his hands and his feet, mimicking the wounds of Jesus on the cross. This is a highly advanced psychic skill that we now know as trance mediumship. In other words, a spirit of intense power was flowing through him, which was manifesting physical wounds upon his body. St. Anthony of Padua was a follower of St. Francis, and he too was a trance medium because he could lecture and speak in languages he never knew. And this was heavily documented by scribes at the time. He went from Italy to Germany and France and spoke about God in languages he never knew and spoke to them in their native tongue. And then perhaps one of the most fascinating saints of this era is St. Clare of Assisi, also an associate of St. Francis and St. Anthony. Now, Clare was known for her great works of charity, compassion, piety, and popes would come to meet with her. The Holy Roman Emperor from Germany, the King of France, all came to pay obeisance to Clare because they saw her as this incredible mystic. But when she became so ill and she could not leave the convent, Clare would pray to God to see what was happening in church, and then she would be able to tell everyone an exact account of what had happened in Mass and around the city of Assisi. And how could she do this? Well, 800 years after her death, Pope Pius XII declared her the patron saint of television. Why? Because Clare was a remote viewer. And a remote viewer is able to take his or her consciousness and project it across the room, across the street, or across the world to give you an exact account of what is happening there. And intelligence agencies, since the British in the 1930s all the way up till now around the world, have been employing remote viewers. So tell me, the Vatican doesn't know about psychics and mediums. And my friends who are priests say, well, yeah, that's what you think the saints were. And so that's why when television was invented and we were receiving visions from afar, well, it had to have a patron saint. Who better than St. Clare? So, if you joined the clergy and received visions of the Holy Spirit or heard dead people, you were declared a saint. But if you didn't, that brings us a century later to Joan of Arc. At age 17, she reported hearing the voices of Michael the Archangel, St. Catherine of Alexandria, and St. Margaret. And they told her that she must become a rallying point for the French people. She grew up in France during the 100 Years' War. Long story short, King of England claimed the throne of France. The Dauphin, the crown prince of France, claimed the throne of France. The English had occupied over half of the country of France. And it got around France that there's this strange girl who says that she can help drive the English away. So she was brought in March of 1429 to the court of Charles, the Dauphin, the crown prince of France. Now, he could not become the king of France unless he was crowned specifically at the cathedral in Reims. So they bring Joan into a room probably about this size, filled with aristocrats, and introduce her to the Dauphin. And she looks at this man dressed as the crown prince and said, "He is not the king of France, he is." And points to a man at the back of the room who was, in fact, the true Dauphin. They wanted to test her. And Charles was so impressed that he allowed Joan to be dressed in armor and to act as a figurehead at the head of the French army, which so inspired the people of France and the French army that they defeated the English at Orleans, and in May of 1429 drove them out, and then they captured the city of Reims, where Charles was crowned the King of France in July of 1429. And in this painting you see, and this was the account of the time, Charles was being crowned the King of France with Joan of Arc, the symbol of French integrity and freedom, at his side. Well, you think things would have gone great and had a happy ending, except for the fact that the English managed to capture Joan and put her on trial in an English court, an ecclesiastical court of English bishops. And this was the biggest trial in the medieval era. There are thousands of pages of court documents. I've read some of them, particularly when she was being interrogated about what saints she claimed to hear. And every king, the pope, everybody in Europe wanted to know what was happening in Joan of Arc's trial. This was the O.J. Simpson trial of the Middle Ages. And she was charged with 70 counts, including heresy, witchcraft, and dressing like a man.